Are you ready to witness the coldest and most ruthless moments in history? This is Last Stand Stories, and today we are telling the true story of those buried in silence beneath the snow.
The snow was silent that morning. The boots of the British officers made only a short, crisp sound as they stepped on the frozen ground. This peculiar sound of compacted snow reached into the wooden building a few hundred meters away. The men who could look out the window saw those uniforms slowly dissolving on the horizon. Those who were in no condition to look simply listened to the sound. The footsteps faded and faded, then they stopped completely. General James Winchester had been taken prisoner in the early hours of January 23, 1813. With Winchester's fall, the entire American defense at Frenchtown had collapsed. British Colonel Henry Proctor had received a formal document of surrender from Winchester. The document covered only the soldiers who surrendered and were able to move. Those who remained were a few hundred men, crammed into wooden houses with frozen bones and shattered legs. Proctor had promised to take these men under his protection. This promise was a military commitment. It was not written. It was verbal. And Proctor walked away in the twilight of that morning, leaving his word behind. Is this a betrayal? Historical records do not show that Proctor knowingly and willingly left these men there. What the records show is simpler and colder. Proctor failed to secure enough sleds and horses to transport the wounded. Whether he made a serious effort to secure them is debatable, and at some point in the debate, Proctor decided to move out. The wounded were left behind. The discipline of the Native American allies was outside of Proctor's calculations. The men inside the wooden building were not included in this calculation. One must understand this. The vast majority of these men had been shot in the legs or hips during the Battle of the River Raisin. Some lay on the wooden floors wrapped in bloody bandages. Some were on mats. Some had simply piled their own clothes beneath them. The room temperature was just above freezing. Their warmth depended on hearths that needed to be stoked every few hours. Some of the windows were broken. The wind blew in through the cracks between the boards. These men could not move. This must be taken not as a metaphor, but as a physiological fact. Bones were shattered. Nerves were severed. They had been losing blood all night. Standing up was not a matter of willpower for those men. They could not stand. During the daylight hours, immediately following the surrender, some of the wounded soldiers understood the situation outside. The British convoy was completing its preparations. The uninjured, captured soldiers were being marched out. Sleds were few, and there was no room for the majority of the wounded. Some American officers later recounted in their testimonies that they had struggled to organize sleds. How effective these efforts were is unknown. The result is evident. A few hundred wounded men were left inside the wooden structures. Outside, the British forces expected to protect them marched north. By the afternoon, the cold had grown even harsher. Some of the men left behind had weapons. Whether the weapons could be used was another matter. Bandaged hands have difficulty pulling a trigger. Arm muscles tremble after a few hours of blood loss. But a weapon was at least an object, something to hold on to, a physical proof that reality still existed. Before night fell, sounds began to emerge from the forest surrounding the settlement. The statements of the survivors on this matter are consistent. American officer Gustavus Elias Bogan Smith described that night in his subsequent court-martial testimony as follows. The forest was not silent. There were sounds of tree branches breaking. It was not the sound of animals. There was a rhythm of footsteps. Potawatomi and Wyandot warriors had remained in the area following Proctor's withdrawal. Why these warriors remained in the area, what Proctor told them or did not tell them, whether the British commander transferred the responsibility of protecting the wounded to these warriors, all these questions remained unanswered on that frozen night in 1813 and have continued to remain unanswered. The men in the wooden buildings knew none of these questions. What they knew was this: the British uniforms were gone. There was no armed force outside to protect them. Sounds were coming from the forest, and they could not move. They could not stand. This sentence stands at the center of this entire history. Much of military history is filled with the stories of people who could make choices. Those who chose to flee. Those who chose to fight. Those who chose to surrender. For most of the men left behind at the River Raisin, none of these options were available. Fleeing requires legs. Fighting requires bodily control. Even surrendering requires being able to stand up and walk to the door. These men could only listen. The forest went silent for a while. Then the sounds started again, closer this time. History usually tells the stories of those who make choices. This chapter of the River Raisin is the story of men who had no opportunity to make a choice. This difference is not a small matter of semantics. This difference is the essence of what was experienced within the wooden walls of that night. Darkness fell with the swiftness of a Michigan winter. The door was struck once. Then they entered. The vast majority of the men lying in the wooden buildings were awake until that moment. The cold did not allow sleep. The pain did not allow sleep. And that strange silence of the forest did not allow sleep. Throughout the night, some of the men had spoken to each other, in low voices, almost in whispers. There were those who said the British would return. There were those who reminded that Proctor had given his word. There were those who said they needed to wait for morning. There was no proof that morning would change anything. But morning was, at the very least, better than the dark. They didn't make it to morning. The Potawatomi warriors made their move before midnight. The exact hour is unknown. The testimonies of the survivors diverge from one another regarding the time. The reason for this is simple. The perception of time for severely wounded men does not operate by clocks. It operates by pain and cold. When the night began, when it ended, when morning came, these questions remain abstract for the men inside those buildings. The sound of doors breaking, however, was not abstract. This sound was heard almost simultaneously across multiple buildings. This was an organized movement. It was not a spontaneous outburst of violence. The warriors had identified the buildings beforehand. They knew which buildings housed the wounded. This knowledge came from having waited around those buildings for hours that night. The first targets of the warriors who entered were the men who could stand up. The later statements of the survivors show a recurring pattern in this regard. Among the wounded, there was a minority who could still move because they were lightly wounded. These men lost their lives either by trying to get out or by reaching for their weapons. Some had started to crawl toward the door. Some shouted. Shouting was the only thing that could be done in that moment, and it was to no avail. The severely wounded were in no condition to shout. This must be recorded as a physiological fact. The shouting capacity of men wounded in the chest and abdomen is limited. Men who have gone into shock from blood loss often appear calm. This calmness is not acceptance. It is the physiological silence created by shock. Some men were already in this silence throughout that night. When the doors broke down, some of these men could not fully comprehend what was happening. Some did. Scalping was a practice deeply rooted in the warfare of Native North Americans, carrying a ritualistic meaning alongside war paint. Historical records document that this practice was systematically applied at the River Raisin. The testimonies of the survivors and subsequent forensic investigations could not definitively determine how many people lost their lives in this manner inside those buildings. Estimates vary across a wide range. The reason for this is simple. The number of surviving witnesses is small, and what the witnesses saw was not the entirety of the scene. What the survivors saw was only the inside of the room they were in. The walls of the wooden buildings hid what was happening in the neighboring room. This secrecy, paradoxically, partially protected some men. The warriors were entering the buildings systematically, but they did not reach every room simultaneously. Some men lived those few minutes where they heard sounds from the neighboring room, while their own room had not yet been entered. What was thought, what was felt within those few minutes? History has not recorded these, nor is it possible for it to record them. What records them is body language, the language of forensics. Forensic investigations in 1813, based partly on mass graves and partly on service remains, showed that a significant portion of the men inside those buildings had tried to move. Bone fracture patterns bear the traces of sudden muscle strains made in the final minutes. Some men tried to use their wounded legs. These attempts failed, but the attempt was etched into the bones. Historian Alan Taylor, in his work examining the American-Canadian border wars of this period, addresses the significance of the river raisin in American military practice, not only through its propaganda value, but also in terms of the ethics of war and the treatment of prisoners. Taylor evaluates Proctor's failure to protect the wounded not as deliberate malice, but as a lack of planning and a matter of priorities. This evaluation does not eliminate moral responsibility. On the contrary, it leads to a colder and more disturbing conclusion. These men did not become victims of an enemy's vengeful plot. They became victims of an ally's administrative negligence. This difference meant nothing to the men inside those buildings, but in terms of historical evaluation, this difference is critical. Negligence produces violence. The violence Proctor produced was not direct, but indirect. The hand that left the wounded there was Proctor's hand. The hands that broke down the doors belonged to others, but the connection between those two hands was forged in the darkness of that night, and this connection was debated repeatedly in court records and British parliamentary inquiries. Proctor was eventually brought before a court-martial. The charge was related to the conditions of the defeat at Frenchtown. The fate of the wounded at the River Raisin entered the agenda of this court. Proctor was sentenced to a reduction in rank. This punishment does not describe what happened inside those buildings. The room goes silent at a certain moment. This silence is a recurring element in the testimonies of the survivors. Violence, after a while, cuts off its own sound. The shouting stops, the movement stops, and the room is left with only the cold and the smoky hearth light. At that moment, some men were still alive. These were in rooms the warriors had not yet reached, or they were men who had been bypassed without drawing attention at that moment, perhaps presumed dead. What did these men feel at the moment the sound stopped? Salvation, anticipation, wood burns. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical fact. Even in the freezing cold of a Michigan winter, dry wood does not simply die out. Once it reaches a certain ignition point, it burns. And when it burns everything inside it as well. The structures at Frenchtown were not built as hospitals. They were simple residential and storage buildings of a frontier settlement. Their walls were single-layer wood siding. Their ceilings were low. Their windows were small. Their doors were too damaged to be bolted from the inside, or were already broken. These buildings were sufficient to protect the people inside from the cold. They were not designed to protect the people inside from fire. Torches were held from the outside of the buildings. This decision is important. Instead of going inside to kill the wounded, the warriors chose to set the buildings on fire from the outside. There was a practical reason for this. Some of the men inside still had weapons. Even though their capacity to use them was limited, entering through a narrow doorway meant turning into an open target. Igniting from the outside eliminated this risk. The result meant this for the men inside. Their points of exit became the starting points of the fire. Smoke precedes heat. This is also a physical fact. When wood ignites, a dense wave of smoke spreads before the flame. This smoke accumulates at low altitudes, first filling the space near the floor. The men lying on the wooden floor were right in the middle of this smoke accumulation. Breathing became difficult, eyes burned, and before the heat became unbearable, the smoke closed off their airways. Some men lost consciousness at this stage. This holds a certain meaning in terms of pain, but in terms of historical record, this loss means this: the last minutes of those men passed unconsciously. They died without fully comprehending what they were in. Some did. The testimonies of the survivors draw a clear distinction in this regard. Some of the men who were close to the door or less severely wounded tried to move the moment they realized the building had ignited. Movement must be redefined here. Not walking, crawling, pushing the floor with arms to advance forward, advancing toward the door while dragging a broken leg behind. This advance could take minutes. A distance of a few meters is the product of minutes of agonizing effort with broken bones. Some men reached the door. Outside the door, there were men waiting. This detail is one of the most recurring and least discussed elements in the historical records of the River Raisin. Survivors recount that the wounded soldiers trying to get out of the door were pushed back, some by the threat of a muzzle, some by physical force. One man reached the doorway while half in flames and was pushed back. This testimony is independently corroborated by more than one survivor. This moment represents a critical threshold in terms of historical documentation, because this moment defines the event not merely as an environment of chaos, but as a conscious act. Pushing back a man trying to exit the door is an active decision. This decision shows that the night was not an entirely spontaneous atrocity. There was planning and execution. There was a capacity to make distinctions, and this capacity was directed toward a specific purpose. Stating exactly what this purpose was is historically difficult. The motivations of the Wyandot and Potawatomi warriors cannot be reduced to a single line. Some historians draw attention to the tensions created by the long-standing alliance politics with the British. Some point to the damage inflicted on the region by American forces in previous campaigns. Some argue that the authority vacuum created by Proctor's withdrawal dissolved the discipline among the warrior groups. None of these explanations describe the man pushed back in the doorway, but they all partially illuminate the path leading to that night. Partially, only partially. Inside the buildings, the heat became unbearable at a certain point. When the wooden ceiling beams ignited, burning pieces began to fall downwards. The floor first reddened, then caught fire. At this stage, smoke was no longer the sole problem. The temperature had reached a level that would directly damage the lungs. To breathe meant to burn. This process was completed within minutes. A wooden structure enters a phase of total combustion when it reaches a specific heat. This phase appears fast from the outside. From the inside, this speed has no meaning. Time is measured by pain, and pain is outside of speed. Smoke rose into the sky around the buildings. In the cold air of the Michigan winter, this smoke hung for a long time. Seen from the horizon, it was like a black column marking the location of Frenchtown. Did the British convoy marching north see this smoke? The memoirs of some British officers leave this question unanswered. Some use expressions implying the smoke was seen. Proctor's memoirs are silent on this matter. Silence is a kind of expression in itself. Exactly how many people lost their lives in Frenchtown that night is not definitively known. The total loss of American forces at the River Raisin is shown in various sources to be between 397 and 500. How much of this number occurred during the battle, and how much that night? This distinction is a question impossible to document under the conditions of 1813. The number of survivors is small, and the survivors did not see the entirety of the scene. There was no one who saw, or more accurately, those who saw were in no condition to recount it later. Those who were in a condition to recount had not seen everything. History has to work with this void. The void is not the material of denial. The void is the event's own silence. And this silence carries the bulk of the historical weight of the River Raisin. When morning came, there were only smoking ruins in Frenchtown and frozen tracks on the snow. Surviving was not a blessing that morning. The men who emerged alive from the buildings were divided into two categories. First, the men the warriors had presumed dead or near death the moment they entered, and therefore bypassed. Second, the men who were caught or surrendered outside the buildings, in the open air. The common point of both categories was this: standing on their feet, or at least appearing able to stand. What happened to those who could not stand has already been documented in Chapter 3. The number of captured men is shown in various sources as between 30 and 60. This number spans a wide range because the situation around Frenchtown that morning did not allow a central commander to keep regular records. Some of the American officers were among the prisoners. Some had lost their lives in the night. Those who remained could not be busy counting others while trying to make sense of their own lives. The prisoners were told they would walk. Fort Malden was in the present-day province of Ontario, near Amherstburg. The distance as the crow flies from Frenchtown was about 30 kilometers. In winter conditions, over ground covered in snow and ice, for men most of whom were wounded and had spent the bulk of the night in freezing cold. This distance was not a mathematical calculation. This distance was a test of how much the body could endure. The answer, for most, revealed itself in a short time. The march began in the early hours of the morning. The weather was a few degrees below freezing. The wind came from Lake Erie and carried snow. A normal person under these conditions, with appropriate clothing and food, can walk 4 kilometers an hour. The clothing of these men was left over from the battle of the previous day. It was wet, bloody, and torn. They had no food, and a significant portion of these men were not normal. They were wounded. One can walk with a broken wrist. It is difficult, but one walks. One can walk with a bullet in the shoulder. Through pain, but one walks. But beyond a certain threshold, the body stops. This stopping stems not from a weakening of will, but from the system shutting down. When blood loss drops below a certain level, when muscle glycogen is depleted, when body temperature approaches the critical limit, the legs stop. First they tremble, then they stop. To fall on the snow that morning was to sign one's death warrant. The testimonies of the survivors present a recurring pattern on this subject. Men who fell to the ground were not helped back up. The warriors standing beside them looked at the fallen man for a few seconds. Then the tomahawk came down. This was not an outburst of anger. This was a practice. The fallen man slows the convoy. A slowed convoy becomes vulnerable in the middle of winter in the northern forests. There are neither sleds nor sufficient manpower to carry the fallen man. The solution is to leave the fallen man behind. But to leave behind carries a different meaning in the war practice of that region. To leave behind means to leave a wounded prisoner to his own fate in enemy territory. This means a long and desolate death. The tomahawk is the abbreviated form of this long death. To understand this logic is not to legitimize it, but to ignore this logic means merely to label that morning as an atrocity and move on. Yet that morning contained a systematic dynamic beyond atrocity. This dynamic fed off the unique practice of the North American border wars, and without understanding this practice, it is impossible to understand the River Raisin. The survivors continued to walk. Walking was not a choice at this point. It was clearly evident what stopping meant. The body pushes pain to the background. This is not a display of willpower, but an automatic response produced by the adrenal system under pressure. Some men later stated in their testimonies that they did not remember a large part of that march. One step produces the next step. Consciousness steps outside this cycle, and the body takes over. The body is sometimes enough. Sometimes it is not enough. At certain points along the road, The convoy took short breaks. During these breaks, some men could not stand back up. A sitting man begins to freeze within minutes. Muscles cool, joints stiffen, and to stand back up requires far more energy than to sit down. This energy was absent in some men. Everyone walking in the convoy knew what happened to the man who fell. This knowledge bestowed a strange discipline upon the convoy. No one fully sat down during the break. One knee touched the ground, but the weight was not put on that knee. Hands rested on the shoulder of the adjacent man. Energy was attempted to be conserved at a minimum level. This was not a conscious survival strategy. This was the body's way of managing itself. For some men, this management worked. In the second half of the road, the snowstorm intensified. Visibility dropped. The convoy was forced to advance in a tighter formation. This tight formation, ironically, protected some men. Walking close to one another reduces the heat cut away by the wind. The crowd turned into an advantage here, but the crowd continued to diminish. The number of men who reached Fort Malden is shown in sources as between 12 and 40. This range reflects the inadequacy of the documentation. The exact number is unknown. What is known is this: a significant portion of those who started the march did not reach the fort. Those who reached the fort could get under a roof for the first time. They warmed up for the first time. They sat down for the first time. Sitting down was not a victory at that point. Sitting down merely meant stopping. And when they stopped, what they had left behind began to find them. Memory begins to process when the body stops. The subsequent testimonies of the survivors rarely recount these first hours in detail. Most describe what they felt, not what they thought, when they arrived at Malden. What they felt is largely cold, physical cold, the burning sensation in feet and toes, the numbness of ears. This physical cold stands like a shield in front of another cold. That other cold was what they would come face to face with when they turned back. For now, there was only the physical cold, and this was enough for that moment. A tragedy, in its raw form, is politically useless. A raw tragedy is messy. It contains contradictory testimonies. It bears uncertain numbers. It cannot place the responsibility on a single target. A raw tragedy is complex, and complexity cannot produce mobilization. For mobilization, the tragedy must be pruned. Unnecessary details are removed, contradictions are smoothed over, and what is left behind is a narrative stark enough to fit into a single sentence. For the River Raisin, this sentence was this: remember the raisin. When exactly this slogan emerged is unknown. Some sources indicate the phrase entered circulation in late February 1813, just a few weeks after the event. Others document that the slogan was used to motivate soldiers during Harrison's Northern campaign. What is certain is this: this slogan spread with increasing momentum in American military and political discourse throughout the year 1813. And as it spread, it pulled a thick layer over the real event. What remained beneath this layer? First, the numbers disappeared. Exactly how many people died at Frenchtown never held a central place in the official discourse, because numbers produce unmanageable questions. How many died in the battle? How many died that night? How many died on the march? These questions distribute responsibility, and distributed responsibility cannot produce a strong enemy image. Then, the structure of responsibility was redrawn. The event had two actors: the British and the Native American warriors. The official American discourse, rather than separating these two actors, melted them into a single block. Native American forces operating under the auspices of British administration were presented as a single enemy image. This amalgamation rendered the diplomatic fiasco Proctor created invisible, because centering Proctor's negligence meant forcing an allied British officer to be held accountable. This was not a suitable framework for functional war propaganda under the conditions of 1813. A cleaner framework was needed. The savage enemy, the defenseless American soldier, the debt of revenge. This framework worked. When General William Henry Harrison took command of the Army of the Northwest, he used the River Raisin slogan directly. He took this event as a reference to motivate his soldiers. When he routed the forces led by Tecumseh and the British powers at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813, this victory was presented directly as the revenge of the raisin. The propaganda cycle was closed. The tragedy legitimized the revenge. The revenge validated the narrative of the tragedy. Harrison emerged from this process not merely as a commander. He emerged as a political figure. The image built upon the victories of Tippecanoe and the Thames carried him to the presidency of the United States in 1840. The wounded soldiers of the River Raisin had paved one of the invisible stones of this journey. To be aware of this irony is not to position Harrison as a historical villain. Nor was Harrison the only person to use propaganda consciously and calculatedly. It is established by historical records that the American government and military leadership instrumentalized various events to keep public support alive throughout the War of 1812. The River Raisin became one of the most fruitful examples of this instrumentalization. Because the truth was enough, there was no need to exaggerate. A choice merely had to be made. What was chosen was this: flames and the death march. What was not chosen was this: Proctor's order to withdraw, the failure to fulfill the prisoner protection commitment, and the legal uncertainty created by Winchester's document of surrender. The choice was deliberate. The American press, especially the Kentucky newspapers, devoted extensive coverage to the River Raisin. Kentucky militias had suffered heavy casualties in the battle, and these casualties awakened a deep political resonance in the state. The newspapers relayed the event in detail. These relays were based on the testimonies of the survivors, and these testimonies were real, but the testimonies were selected. It was determined which details would stand out, which questions would not be asked. The unasked question was this: how did the American chain of command leave these men to that night? This question did not enter the agenda of the American public in 1813, because this question would have triggered a mechanism of internal accountability rather than an enemy image. In wartime, internal accountability is demoralizing. A demoralizing question impedes the function of war propaganda. The question was not asked. Instead, the victims were glorified. But this glorification used not the victims, but the images of the victims. Real men, with their real names, their real injuries, and the real final minutes they experienced inside those wooden buildings, did not take place within this narrative. What took place within the narrative was a symbol. The symbol turned into a cry of revenge, and the cry of revenge covered the real bodies from which the symbol was produced. This mechanism of covering is not unique to the River Raisin. Much of military history is full of examples where this mechanism was applied in different forms. The politicization of tragedy is one of the fundamental tools of modern state practice, but the River Raisin is one of the examples where this mechanism can be seen in a particularly naked form, because the real event was so far removed from the propaganda narrative. The propaganda narrative said this: American soldiers were slaughtered by a savage enemy. This requires revenge. The reality was this: American soldiers lost their lives to a result jointly produced, partly by the negligence of an Allied officer, partly by an alliance's indiscipline, and partly by the Michigan winter. This required accountability from more than one side, on more than one level. Accountability was not sought. Instead, the slogan was produced. The slogan spread, and the slogan, over time, overtook the event itself. Today, many Americans who hear the name River Raisin know this slogan. They do not know the details of the event. They do not know the name of Proctor. They do not know the march to Fort Malden. What they know is a cry of revenge. The men lying beneath that cry were silenced in 1813. Their silencing occurred not once but twice. First, when they failed to make it through that night. Second, when the testimonies of those who made it through the nights melted into a political narrative. The second silencing lasted longer because it was built upon the first. A dead witness cannot speak. The witnesses who speak are not those who think they are speaking. Their voice was heard as selected, pruned, and rearranged to serve another purpose. What history owes to this event is to record the unrearranged state of that voice. To do this completely is not possible. The final minutes inside those buildings have not been documented, nor was it possible for them to be documented. But what is possible is this: to extract the story of those men from within a manufactured narrative of revenge, to remove them from being the material of a slogan. This is not romantic historiography. This is a clinical necessity. Because the slogan did not kill them, the slogan used them once again. And accurately naming those who were used is the most fundamental and least fulfilled obligation of historiography.
The truth is not always heroic. Subscribe to Last Stand Stories for more dark chapters of history. See you in the next tale of tragedy and resistance.